past.
Good morning. I'm Eugene Scott, a political reporter with The Washington Post, and welcome to Washington Post Live. This morning, we're discussing confronting America's digital divide. We're going to have a conversation with two phenomenal congresswomen discussing the digital gap during a global pandemic between many of the haves and have-nots in our country's education system. My first guests are two leading congresswomen on this issue, Kathy McMorris Rodgers from the state of Washington and Donna Shalala from Florida. Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
First, can we actually define what the digital divide is? Many people hear that term but have no idea what that means. If you could share first, McMorris Rodgers, how you define that phrase.
Sure. Well, and thank you for highlighting this. I believe that closing the digital divide must be a top priority. I come from a district in Eastern Washington that is centered around the city of Spokane, but then in the outlying areas, I have many remote rural areas where there is still no coverage, little coverage. I define the rural divide, or the digital divide, I should say, the digital divide, because it's beyond rural. It's underserved communities, it's rural, remote communities, individuals and communities that do not have an internet connection, do not have broadband services. Some areas are still dependent upon dial-up, some have nothing, but then others have very little. It doesn't meet the needs for education, for telehealth, for growing an economy, and that is the digital divide as I would explain it.
And Congresswoman Shalala?
It's really a gap between the haves and the have-nots. Those that have access to the internet and can afford it for their kids, for their families, and those that don't. And it's both rural areas in our country, and I have family in North Dakota, so I'm well aware of the rural challenges, but the urban challenges are 3 times as large. And we've done a lot of things for the rural areas, not enough in my judgment, but boy, we have to take on urban areas in our country, because that's where large numbers of people don't have access to the digital divide. And the county that I represent has the 3rd highest percentage of households without an internet subscription. That gives you some sense of the challenges.
Indeed. And so we have an idea about the digital divide when it comes to urban and rural, and in other ways, perhaps, that it exists in this country. But Congresswoman McMorris Rodgers, can you talk a bit about how it maybe disproportionately affects people of color and low-income citizens?
Sure. Well, I think what we're seeing is that you have this gap, this opportunity gap that is being heightened right now during COVID around digital connection, and whether it may be people of color or low income, people who live rural. I feel this opportunity gap is widening, and I heard about this before COVID, that kids needed an internet connection in order to do their homework, and more of our schooling, our education is online, and homework is done online. And so it is critical that kids have that internet connection, and yet they were having to go to a hotspot in, near the school or at McDonald's or whatever it may be. And then COVID hit. I have 3 young kids, so I have lived the reality of having kids at home. And even with an internet connection, there was more of a burden on our household, and trying to manage all of that. We're seeing where the educational opportunity divide is widening, and it's heartbreaking because education is so foundational to an opportunity for a better life. And so if kids do not have access to the internet, if they do not have access, and then right now they do not have access to virtual school and staying on track with their schooling and their education. So this is foundational to an opportunity for a better life.
That's interesting. And I'm sorry.
Colleague, we had a wonderful colleague that died recently, Representative John Lewis, and he said that access to the internet is the civil rights issue of the 21st century. He saw it as fundamental to closing the gap, not only between rich and poor and rural and urban areas, but between minorities, low-income minorities, and the rest of the population. So think of it that way, as fundamental to bringing our country together and having quality education and quality healthcare.
Congresswoman Shalala, can you speak to how that divide also exists in higher education? We know that before you were in Congress, you were president of a couple of colleges, and so we know that this is not something that is unique to K through 12.
Yeah, everybody thinks that free tuition solves the problem of higher education for low-income students. It does not, because there are so many other things that you need. As faculty members increasingly put everything online. I certainly did it as a professor because I wanted to reduce the cost of books. But students, college students, also needed access to laptops and access to the internet, to high-speed internet. And while we may have had that in the dormitories, access to good laptops, I can't tell you how many students I personally bought laptops for. Their laptops were stolen or broken. They couldn't finish their homework. And, I personally went and got them laptops. And all the universities I was at kept a storage bin of them because they wanted to make sure that every student had all of the things that they needed to have a good education. So we have to think about not only access to schooling, but what students need to be successful there. And clearly, access to the internet and to the equipment to hook up to the internet is critical. And by the way, this is so bipartisan.
Mm-hmm. It is.
Congresswoman McMorris Rogers, another thing to think about here is the FCC. We know that you have been critical of the FCC for not meeting the broadband needs of rural communities. Is there anything that can be done to fix that?
Yes, yes. I'm really encouraged that just this year we passed bipartisan legislation in the House, signed by the president in March, that will update our maps. And as Donna just said, this is a bipartisan issue. There is a recognition that this is so important to our country, to America, to our future. Closing the digital divide is it may be our number one priority, because it impacts education, it impacts students, healthcare, telehealth, our economy and economic future. But the legislation that we passed will update the maps. So we have been spending billions of dollars through the FCC and through USDA rural development. And these maps were used to determine the priority areas for funding, where the greatest needs were, whether it was in Donna's area that may be more urban or in rural remote areas. And yet the maps were not accurate. So in my district, the largest city is Spokane. The map showed 100% of Spokane County covered. You go 15, 20 miles south of Spokane, they have nothing. They do not have a wireless connection. They do not have broadband. They have nothing. You go north and it showed 97% of Ferry County. Ferry County is it's more accurate that it's 3% covered, just the opposite. And so updating these maps is an important first step, because the federal government has been making a big investment, but we need to make sure that it is smart and that it is strategic. So I think this legislation was an important step in the right direction, and really pleased that we were able to come together and get it done.
And the FCC, to give them some credit, they recently did the health care support program for rural hospitals. We need to do a lot more for individuals. And, Kathy, there's a lot of money in the E-rate program, and about $2 billion, I think, sitting over there at the FCC, and we ought to be using it to get to individuals. What we're
Yes.
talking about now is not institutions, but individuals and
Mhm.
getting it to individual families so the kids have access.
Mhm. That's an
Both of
important
you,
point. We really had focused on making sure, like, the money that we put into fiber, we were laying it to the institutions, so hospitals and schools and libraries. But now it really is the individuals and families, and a lot of people refer to it as the last mile, how we get it to the home, no matter where that person may live.
And if you think about it as a fundamental right, the way John Lewis did,
mhm,
and you know that the whole country is for it, this has to be one of our priorities. We've
right.
got to make sure it's a way of closing gaps, these disparities that we keep talking about. So I couldn't be more enthusiastic about this as a strategy to close so many of our educational gaps. Not all of them, but if you don't have access, and a lot of this is affordability.
Mm.
All the studies show that it's affordability issue, not just infrastructure, but really an affordability issue. And Representative Clyburn had a bill, um, and we put it in the Heroes with the Heroes Act. Um, but you know, we need to make it affordable as well for families. And I know, you know, one of the problems the FCC has is they've been focused on this system was originally set up for telephones, not for cable or the
Right.
other parts of the internet. So we need to force them to think about the 21st century and think about individuals and individual families.
I guess my next question is if closing the gap is a priority for so many Americans, and it's also a bipartisan issue, as you both mentioned, what is keeping Congress from making progress in this area, given that so many people seem to be invested in it?
Mhm. Well, I think we are making progress. So I think it's important to recognize the investments that have been made, both by the federal government, as I just mentioned, in big investments to make sure that institutions, the hospitals, the libraries, the schools had that basic fiber. I also think that the work that we've done around mapping is really important. But part of it, at least in my district, it is having the technology to be able to reach that final mile. So I'm really excited about some new technology, innovative technology using white spaces, for example, TV white spaces. Microsoft has a pilot project right now in one of the most remote regions of my district to be able to transmit that signal using TV white spaces. So when I was a kid, we had 3 stations, 2, 4, and 6, and sometimes it would get a little fuzzy. With today's technology, you can send those signals more clearly and be able to utilize the space in between those TV stations. So I'm really excited, and I have worked and pushed the FCC to be able to use this kind of technology. So some of it is making sure that we are embracing the new ways to deliver the signal, because laying fiber is part of basic. I think that's part of basic infrastructure anymore. It's the same as the importance of electricity. I believe that fiber is so important, but there are regions I know in my district where laying fiber today is cost prohibitive, and so this new technology will help in ways that we also need to be exploring.
You know,
As you two
Comcast has a
know,
program. Yeah,
no, please
Comcast
go
has a
ahead.
program launch over 1,000 Wi-Fi connected lift zones and community centers nationwide. And the Miami Heat here is the first South Florida organization to join this effort. The service is free for some eligible low-income households, and others can pay as low as $9.95 a month. So we need more of that to help, and we need to cover the country. This is doable in the next year or so. We just have to make sure that everybody sees the connection between this and what we're going through in terms of the pandemic, because it really is connected.
Great. As you two know, we have an election coming up in less than 5 weeks, and I would love to hear your thoughts on why you believe a certain candidate, be it President Trump or Joe Biden, is best equipped to address this issue of the digital divide.
I actually think Kathy and I are the best candidates to address the.
That's great, Donna. I
We've
love
got to elect people from both parties who are committed and understand how central this is to closing a lot of these disparities gaps and providing opportunity in our country. I know Joe Biden is deeply committed to doing this within a short period of time, but I want to make it very clear that this has to be bipartisan. We've got to put that kind of energy behind this.
hmm And I appreciate what Donna had to say. From my perspective, this is an important part of America winning the future. And we just passed out of the Energy and Commerce Committee a package of bills around emerging technology. And as I think about some of these issues, these are not Republican or Democrat issues. These really are about America, and it's about America's future and making sure that everyone that is given that opportunity for a better life, that no one's left behind. And I know that my heart's broken. My son, at the end of the school year, he's in 7th grade, and we turned in all of his material for school, and his school was telling us that 35% of the kids did nothing. And as I talk to schools in Eastern Washington, part of that big challenge is the internet connection. And so I think winning the race to 5G is really important. It's important to our economy. It's important to our children, that next generation. It's important to our national security. I just introduced some legislation that would do an inventory of spectrum that is currently within the federal government, so that we can get a better handle on what's available and how it's being used, so that we can be smarter about how we deploy and make sure that we are not leaving anyone behind, that we are closing this digital divide once and for all. And finally, I would also just say that I think this is a public-private, it's going to take the public sector and the private sector. And I appreciated Donna pointing out what Comcast has done. Actually, 800 companies during this pandemic signed the FCC's Keep America Connected plan for this summer and going into the fall, a commitment to step up and make sure that no one was being cut off during this pandemic. And that's the kind of all hands on deck approach that we need to have.
Well, Congresswoman McMorris Rogers and Congresswoman Shalala, I so appreciate you taking time out of your day to speak with us and share with our viewers your thoughts on this very, very important issue.
Thank you for highlighting it. Good to be with you, and good to be with you too, Donna.
You too, Kathy. Thank you very much. This is really important.
You all have a great day.
Thank you.
I now want to bring in Abhijit Walia. He is the global head of technology at Deutsche Bank, and he's looked into this very critical issue of the digital divide and had some very creative ideas on how to tackle it. But before I do that, I want to check out a video about his work to give you an idea of exactly what he's been up to. I want to welcome Abhijit Walia to the Washington Post Live, and our guests and our audiences to share what it is that we can do to close the digital divide in a global pandemic. Thanks for coming on today.
Hello, Eugene. Great to be here.
Awesome. So one way you think we should solve this problem is for big tech companies to do something few companies seem to ever do, which is give away something for free. Can you talk about that a bit, and what is it exactly that you have in mind?
Yeah, so we approached the study looking at the digitization divide in the country. Of course, COVID has brought it out of the open. And we approached with an open mind, looking at what's going on between rural and urban, skilled, unskilled, educated, and uneducated. And unfortunately, find the access to technology in the country has a lot to do with the color of your skin. And the divide in the urban cities, between people of color, Black and Hispanic, and others, is staggering. And we saw in the data, Black and Hispanic families 10 years behind others in broadband penetration. 4 times more Black Americans say they have poor tech connectivity. PC penetration, 20 to 30% gap between Black Hispanic families and others. So the gap is fairly strong, and it's persistent. And then COVID gave us a litmus test as to what it could do. And we looked at geolocation data, hourly mobility in neighborhoods around the country, in big cities, Black neighborhoods and others, and found mobility in Black neighborhoods was 135% higher in the month of April when COVID was max lockdown. Essentially, lack of access to work from home jobs, lack of access to connectivity, essentially rendered them vulnerable to step out of their homes. So tech today, as rightly said in the previous segment, is not just about quality of life. If you don't have good tech, it could be a death sentence. That is why it's so important for this to be connected to long-term returns of tech. And we talk about the industry, we look at it in terms of most industries, if we go back last couple of 100 years, who were so successful as big tech has been, it's benefited so much due to the e-commerce curve being pulled forward, primarily during COVID. Industries make a mistake. And right now, we have a large underbelly of this e-commerce demand curve, which is hurting a big part of society, the ones who are not as digitized. We did a study, and we looked at if the gap, this digital gap, is not addressed, and we go forward 25 years, and the way digitization works, it could happen faster. In one generation alone, 8 out of 10 jobs in the country would be out of reach for large swaths, 60 to 80% of minorities, because the level of skill gap there exists. So this becomes an issue for big tech companies where a big part of the market is going to be vulnerable. And that's why I believe it's not just about giving something for free. I believe it's investment which helps them in the long run.
You know, Abhijit, I hear every point you're making, but some people would hear that and say, you want big tech companies to give away millions to low-income Americans so that they can go online. What's in it for the companies?
Okay, so this is a very important point. One, big tech is getting largely unpopular in the country. Our research shows 1 out of 3 Americans are upset with big tech, what's happening, disenchantment, digitization, and they have a lot of issues with privacy. So doing something which is bipartisan will build a lot of goodwill in the country. That is important. The second thing is, if you were to look at markets overseas and the way investments work, so look at emerging market and say, let's compare the demographic I'm talking about. It's about 30 million people, incomes under 30,000, people of color living in the big cities. Let's look at their level of entrenchment in tech and compare it to, say, a country like India. This demographic is 3 times the purchasing power of the Indian market, and is a market which is growing in the country, in New York, LA, Chicago, in the cities of the country. And if you be talking about a plan which is $15 billion, which provides access to tech, connectivity, hardware, and most importantly, training to middle school and high school students, which essentially is an ecosystem of mentorship so they get digitized. Most of our research showed that digital inequity early on in life has a major outcome later in life. And that's why we believe this is important. And a lot of our studies showed that there's a high correlation between access to tech and access to tech skills and increase of earnings and net income 12 months later, especially in families of color. So if you were to look at this plan of 15 billion we're talking about, let's compare it to what I said earlier. India, a country where big tech is going in the last 2 months, big tech and others have invested close to $20 billion. So because it's an emerging market. So let's frame that. There's a market here in the country, and we're saying if you put in $15 billion over the next 5 years, you're looking at a market which will grow and will be multiple returns for big tech if that step is taken.
I want to thank you again for coming on Post Live to share these ideas with us. I imagine you've shared them with big tech before now, and I'd be interested in hearing what type of feedback you've received. Is any of this realistic?
Yes, we're an inductive species and data has to be presented in a coherent way. This is about money, but it's also about rolling up your sleeves and stepping in and doing it. And I think industries, sometimes the focus has to be there. I believe that's the part of the study, to be able to enlighten people. And I think we're making a step in the right direction. A lot of positive feedback saying if we can align the investment in these communities with the commercial interest, because a lot of happens, the change happens in society is because of economic gain. If you align the two as a narrative, will make a major impact. I believe we're going in that direction.
How can you tell when we're actually moving in the right direction on this issue from when you're just being paid lip service regarding buy-in?
That's very true. I spoke to a lot of academia, HBCU professors. There's a lot of tokenism which has happened, and that's why we're sitting here with this inequity in society. I believe, if I do this report a year from now and I look at my data and we see the gap reducing, I see in the numbers, we see a linearity which starts to see the gap going down. That's when we say the step is right direction. Tokenistic announcements don't help. The actual data, bottom-up data, when we survey, shows Black and Hispanic not 10 years behind. The penetration rates changing. That's when we start to see a difference.
One approach to the digital divide that we are hearing quite often is about the issue of rights, and this being a civil right. The access to internet is a fundamental right, even a prerequisite to being able to function completely in a modern society. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, absolutely. COVID showed us the lack of access to connectivity and tech can have a major impact on one's life, one's health. So yes, I do believe going forward, this is something which is going to change globally and just especially in the US, where tech connectivity is going to become a fundamental right.
I've also read some of your work and seen interviews, and you've talked about the digital divide being a ticking time bomb. The idea that we don't have forever to address this issue, and you've even been a bit disappointed that there's still been some resistance to moving forward in the direction that you deem is best. Can you talk a bit about the reasons for that resistance?
I think one has to accept reality. It's very important to know the data is there, which shows this gap. So I'm going to give you a perspective from an investment perspective. If you look at the spectrum of digitization, what it's doing globally, and you look at, say, the country, you break it from 1 to 100, from skilled to unskilled. What digitization is doing, or big tech is doing, is essentially through the automation that's sucking out productivity from the bottom half of the skill force and transferring through a wealth effect to the top 5%. That's why the question I was always asked, why are the markets not reflecting the underlying economy or what's happening in the underlying country? That disconnect is there. And then on top of that, you've got this powerful backstop from quantitative easing, which has gone on for quite some time, which provides liquidity to these companies and the markets, where every time there's some slowdown or correction, the backstop gives them the ability to behave and go out there and take globally and acquire more. And I think this virtuous loop is what's creating this issue. And if it's not something addressed, the digital gap is not addressed, we believe in 25 years, large swaths of society will have major issues with the work of the jobs which we presented. And I think that has to be looked at. And big tech has the know-how, has the skills, and has the resources to come and address this.
Well, Abji, I really appreciate you coming on Post Live to address this issue with us and educating our viewers on this very important topic.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Indeed. I'll be back in a few minutes with our former Secretary of Education, John King, to continue this discussion.
This year's been tough, but I don't know, it's given me a lot of time to learn new skills through the internet.
I've been joining more classes during lockdown. I taught myself how to play guitar online.
I'm doing an internship.
I created a small nonprofit foundation.
So when people ask,
how is schoolwork going to be turned in?
how will I continue studying?
How are we going to do this online?
I feel like I'm ready.
I'm ready.
I'm ready for anything.
Hello, my name is Jose Diaz-Balart. I am the anchor for Noticias Telemundo, as well as the anchor of NBC Nightly News Saturday. It is a privilege and a pleasure to be with you today. I want to thank you for having this conversation on such an important topic, one that really is oftentimes not discussed with the depth that I think we should be discussing. It is a pleasure to have with us today Delilah Wilson Scott, Senior Vice President of Community Impact for Comcast NBCU, also President of Comcast NBCU Foundation, and someone who has been really kind of focused on the digital divide and conquering America's digital divide, which is the subject of today's conversation. Delilah, it is great to see you.
Great to be here, Jose.
Well, with the big picture. For more than 10 years, Comcast has been really working to help gap the digital divide in this country. You've connected more than 8 million people, which is a huge accomplishment. But tell me why you think this digital divide still persists.
Well, the digital divide is really a factor of the opportunity divide overall. So as you've mentioned, we've been focused on this for nearly a decade. We're, fortunate to have connected a few million households, but we know this issue is far from being resolved. I mean, first, I really want to break down the issue of access versus adoption. So when we look at access, we look across America, there are pockets of the country, rural areas mostly, where there's no viable access to the internet. But then there are the pockets we're focused on where adoption is really the larger issue, and that's urban centers, metropolitan areas, where the internet access is readily available, yet and still there's so many barriers to adoption, quite frankly. If we take a step back and just think about poverty in this country, you talked about those children. 38 million people in America are living in poverty. And amidst COVID, every single challenge they're facing, including lack of internet access, has been exacerbated, whether it's job security, housing security, knowing where your next meal is going to come from. All of these are very complicating before COVID and certainly complicated now. And so we've decided that, our focus would be on what we consider to be the three most significant barriers to adoption. In this time of COVID, many more partners have joined us in fighting this digital divide, this opportunity divide. But those three barriers are simply, one is affordability. We've had our Internet Essentials product, high-speed internet, $9.95 a month. Second is access to equipment, so access to free and discounted laptops, tablets. We know these are key devices to leverage the internet access, especially from home. While smartphone access is available to many, we all know that applying for a job, trying to access healthcare, and of course, virtual schooling is impossible with just smartphone access. And probably the most critical barrier is just access to skills, awareness, and knowledge. So some families believe, well, out of necessity, I need to work outside the home. I don't have children in the home. So it seems like, it's not a critical it's not a critical tool that you need. Or there's trust issues. We see this a lot in immigrant populations. But we know that once people are connected and have access and know how to access resources, whether it's access to free, high quality job training, healthcare resources, et cetera, that makes all the difference and really helps stave that adoption process. And that's really what we're trying to promote, those three barriers. And we know we can't do it alone, but we're committed to doing everything we can to support that.
Delilah, I'm just wondering, I've seen Internet Essentials evolve. And given COVID-19 and the situation has put many more Americans in terms of schools, we just talked about, but also work. What else has Comcast done to deal with this reality, which is an ever-changing reality as well?
It absolutely is. We've committed to listening to our customers, our community partners, elected leaders about what features make the most sense. And while COVID-19 was certainly not on the roadmap for any of us, we've done a number of different things this year, especially on affordability and access. Number one is we've increased the speed. And essentially that means multiple people in one household can access video conferencing. That's critical for virtual schooling and other resources. So that's huge. Second, in kind of the bucket of affordability, we immediately offered Internet Essentials at no cost for the first 60 days for all Internet Essentials customers. And in conjunction with that, we waived all back debt due to Comcast for new IE customers. These were two critical pieces on top of the low cost that we already offer for Internet Essentials at just $9.95. The other piece was opening up 1.5 million public Wi-Fi hotspots. So when you think about the Wi-Fi you might access in a small business, an outdoor space, parks, transit hubs and the like. These were hotspots previously only available to Xfinity customers, but we've opened that up to the public so people can access the internet anywhere they need it. And probably the piece I think we're most excited about is we recently expanded what we refer to as our Internet Essentials Partners Program. So since March, you started off the conversation about everybody being acutely aware and familiar with how important it is to access the internet just so that we could access schooling when schools were closed. So we've been able to work with cities, school districts, foundation partners, philanthropy across the country to provide free access at no cost to over 200,000 K-12 students. That's in Atlanta, DC, Philadelphia, Chicago, San Francisco, et cetera. We knew that was a critical program to have in place. But to your point, we know that that connectivity is not enough alone, and I'm excited to sort of build on that program, but we know connectivity is just the starting point, and it's still a challenge to get people to adopt, even when cost is off the table and even when equipment is provided.
Delilah, finally, you're the president of Comcast NBC Universal Foundation. The chairman of this corporation, Brian Roberts, made a substantial announcement to address not only digital equality issues, but also social justice. Tell me more about that work and where you are headed.
You know, Jose, this year is like no other in terms of how loud and specific the cause for racial justice has been. And obviously Comcast is not immune to that. And I think, you know, I'm proud of our CEO, Brian Roberts, our leadership, and wanting to take a step back and be introspective about it and really understand what we could do over and above. So truly incremental to our existing diversity, equity, and inclusion commitments. And that's what led to our $100 million commitment to advance social justice and equality. The first thing we wanted to do, though, is really focus on the areas where we thought we were uniquely positioned to make a difference. So areas that leveraged our talent, our technology, our media reach. You know, these are important assets we use to advance our business, but they're also the assets that we want to use to advance our community as well. So we looked at social justice, employees. If we can't be fair to our own employees, we certainly aren't in a position to help address communities, small business opportunity, media awareness, and finally, digital equity. You know, we heard a little bit about the work we're doing in connectivity. It obviously makes sense to be here. We have a lot of learning, but we know that it's not enough. And as I mentioned, that connectivity we see as a beginning point, not as an end point. And if we don't act with urgency, communities of color, communities in lower economic status points, those are the ones that are going to be most disproportionately negatively impacted. And we definitely don't want to see that happen. We also want to support leaders of color in this moment. You know, that's what social justice is all about. And we think it's pretty important that we stick to that as we move forward.
The fact is that we have to realize just how critical this situation is. And I'm so glad, Delilah, that you were able to give us a bigger picture and a bigger understanding of things that can and must be happening to bridge that digital divide. Delilah, it is always a pleasure to see you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Jose.
And now we turn it over to our friends at the Washington Post.
There are parents and caregivers that are not home, they're working. We know that that could be a barrier for the student to access the learning, given that they don't have the structures and the supports necessary.
For the family's Los Angeles kitchen will be their online classroom. Lacking computers or tablets, some were provided through the school district.
We have to pay rent, bills, food. We don't make enough money to pay $80 to $100 for internet.
Our final guest this morning has been looking at all aspects of schooling almost his entire professional life, including being the 10th Education Secretary under President Barack Obama. John King is now the president and CEO of the Education Trust. Welcome, Secretary King.
Thanks so much. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you. Now, Secretary King, you ran the Education Department for President Obama. What should the federal role be in combating the digital divide?
Well, look, much like the federal government in the era of the New Deal committed to ensure access to electricity throughout the country, I think today the federal government's role should be to ensure access to internet throughout all of our communities. We need the internet to access education, to access healthcare, to access benefits, to interact in the contemporary world. And so we ought to make sure everyone has that, just as we did with the Tennessee Valley Authority during the New Deal period.
Can you talk a bit about the federal government being responsible for providing more resources versus them maybe simply assisting states and localities in providing direct assistance?
Sure. Well, look, we've got estimates of as many 16 million kids who aren't able to access education because they don't have access to the internet. We have a moral responsibility to solve that. We have a program, the E-rate program, which is designed to help get internet access to schools. We could repurpose that program and make a significant investment in that program to make sure that every kid has internet access. In the long run, we also need to do more to make sure we have reliable internet access in rural communities, as you heard about from Congresswoman McMorris earlier. We also need an effort to make sure that folks aren't locked out of internet access because of financial barriers. What often happens in high needs urban communities is folks have internet access, but then the cable company says, well, you can't get on the internet because you have an unpaid cable bill. Well, we shouldn't let that unpaid cable bill get in the way of kids being able to access education today.
There's a lot of discussion, including from you, about the importance of public-private partnerships in addressing the digital divide. Can you talk a bit about what the business community can do to combat this issue?
Sure. Well, the business community could take steps to subsidize internet access. Certainly cable companies are in a position to do that. I think they have a moral responsibility to do that, to put in place plans that allow students in both K-12 and higher ed to have internet access. But the business community can also be an advocacy partner in calling on Congress to step up. The newly revised HEROES Act that's being considered in the House of Representatives actually includes $12 billion for internet access in K-12. We desperately need that. And the truth is, we had that need even before COVID. We had a homework gap before COVID, and we weren't paying as much attention. But now COVID has laid bare the scope of the disparities here, and we have a responsibility to act.
We've heard a lot about schools' various needs during this pandemic. You talked about some of them just with that answer to that question. But when you think about the things schools need most to address the digital divide, what comes to mind first?
Yeah. Well, certainly this issue of internet access, but devices are also crucial. We have kids who are trying to learn right now on their mom's cell phone because they don't have a laptop or iPad. So we also need resources for devices. The CARES Act, which Congress passed earlier this year, provided some resources that were helpful, but school districts need a lot more. Again, this revised version of the HEROES Act includes upwards of $200 billion for education. That's essential to make sure that school districts can afford to get a device to every student during this period when so many school districts are using a hybrid model or are completely remote. And we know disproportionately it's low-income students and students of color who are in situations where they don't have that device, they aren't able to access education.
We've discussed quite a bit how difficult it is for students to learn during a pandemic, but we also know that it's really hard for educators to teach and to instruct during a pandemic. What additional burden does having a digital divide put on those responsible for teaching our kids during a time like this?
Yeah, such an important point. I mean, we have teachers who struggle with internet access. Again, particularly in high needs urban and high needs rural communities, we have folks who don't have reliable internet to connect with their students. We know that there are some school districts where students essentially were missing for the entirety of the spring. But in Los Angeles Unified School District, only about 60% of students were regularly engaged in online learning. There are thousands of students who didn't interact with their teachers at all during the spring. Their teachers are worried about them. They're worried about their academic well-being. They're worried about their socio-emotional well-being. They're worried about their safety. That's a lot of weight for our educators to carry. We also know that the districts with the least resources often had the hardest time providing good professional development for teachers on how to use the technology effectively to teach their students. Again, it's a reason why we really need Congress to step up with stimulus dollars for school districts so they can provide that professional development to their teachers who are needing to figure out, how do I design lessons that are engaging for first graders who are on Zoom, right? That's a complicated undertaking. We need to support our teachers in that work.
We know that one of the major conversations happening in our society this past summer, and since this entire presidency began, it's been about racial inequalities. And can you talk a bit about why minority communities and people of color are hit just so much more harder by the digital divide than perhaps white students in more affluent neighborhoods?
Sure. Well, we know from the Pew study, even before COVID, about 79% of white families had reliable internet access. 66% of Black families, 61% of Latino families. So think of that huge gap in internet access before COVID. And then you had COVID, the disparate health impact on communities of color, the disparate economic impact on communities of color. And so that digital divide has likely grown. I mean, you heard about in the video you just showed, families who are making the choice between paying the cable bill or paying for groceries. And so that this challenge of racial inequality is very much part of the digital divide. It's an extension of the impact of systemic racism on really throughout our society for the last 400 years. But we have a responsibility now to take action to close these divides. Otherwise, we risk having a lost generation of students who will have had the schoolhouse door barred for them because of a lack of access to the internet or to devices.
Secretary King, there are some Americans who view owning a laptop or owning cell phones, especially something like an iPhone, as a luxury. But we've seen increasingly the idea that internet access is a civil rights issue, something fundamental to the human right experience because of what it can do in terms of addressing issues of healthcare, education, and other areas of access. Can you share your thoughts on the idea that the digital divide is a civil rights issue?
Well, there's no question. I mean, if you don't have the internet today, you are barred from accessing K-12 education. You're in many cases barred from accessing higher education. You have a much harder time finding a job because we are advertising today for jobs on the internet. You have a harder time accessing benefit programs that are vital to the safety and well-being of your family. If you don't have the internet, it's harder to be an engaged citizen because so much information is shared on the internet about the issues affecting our country. So it is very much a civil rights issue to say everyone ought to have internet access. And we are the wealthiest country in the world, arguably the wealthiest country that has ever existed in the world. We have the resources to make sure people have the internet. And so when we think about recovery from COVID, we have to think about not just how do we get back to the status quo, the inequitable status quo before COVID, but how do we create a stronger future? And that stronger future ought to include internet access for everyone so that people can participate in the 21st century economy.
We know that some of the neighborhoods that have the highest percentage of low-income residents still often have fast food restaurants and other businesses that do actually end up having a broadband or internet access. But those communities still have adoption issues in terms of individuals and families being able to access the internet. Can you explain why that's the case?
Sure. Well, you've got a couple things going on. In some cases, the cable companies have been less willing to invest in high needs urban communities. And so folks don't have reliable high-speed internet access. In some cases, you have financial obstacles for folks paying for a cable bill that includes the internet, or you have financial obstacles for homeowners or landlords to putting in appropriate wiring so that folks can access the internet. And you do have these self-help remedies that people are going to a fast food restaurant. You have school districts who are putting Wi-Fi hotspots on buses and parking them in certain neighborhoods so people can access the internet. But at the end of the day, those remedies are inadequate to the task. We ought to do what's necessary to make sure that kids have the internet. And there are school districts that are doing that. They're investing in hotspots for kids. There are school districts that are even building towers themselves so that they can make sure that there's internet access for their students. But we as a society have a responsibility to our children. McKinsey did a study that suggests that based on the closures in the spring and the hybrid and distance learning models in place this fall, we're likely to see at least 7 months of learning loss on average for all students, 9 months for Latino students, 10 months for African American students. That's a devastating level of learning loss. We can remedy that if we ensure that we have internet access, that we have device access, that teachers have the professional development and support they need, and that we provide intensive academic intervention for the kids who've fallen behind. And that's the least we can do if we want to protect the long-term health of our economy and our democracy.
As you know, we're about 5 weeks away from an election, and we haven't heard as much about education and specifically public schools as we've heard in perhaps some past election cycles. Based on what you know and what you've been listening to and reading regarding the candidates, President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden, which one of these men has the best plan to address this digital divide to you?
Well, look, the reality is we are where we are because of choices that the current administration has made. The current administration could have responded more aggressively to COVID in the first place, so we didn't end up needing to have so many schools doing virtual or hybrid learning models this school year, right? Some of our international peers had a more aggressive strategy around testing, contact tracing, mask policies, and so they don't have the rate of community spread that's forcing extended closure of schools that we do. So that's a choice this administration made. We knew in the spring, given the rate of COVID spread, we were likely to see schools relying on hybrid or virtual models this fall, and yet they didn't act. They didn't do the things necessary through the FCC or in partnership with Congress to dedicate resources to close the internet gaps. So they didn't act on COVID adequately. They didn't act on supporting schools adequately. We haven't seen the infusion of resources that are needed by school districts given the economic crisis and its impact on state budgets. And so schools are at risk of having to cut people in this moment where students have such desperate needs. That was a choice this administration made. So, you know, the question before the American public is one of looking at the record, how we got here, and then the plan going forward. It is encouraging, I think, that Vice President Biden has talked about the need to make a massive investment in our highest needs schools. He's talked about tripling the Title I program. That would go a long way towards helping to address some of the needs in our schools. And certainly he has talked about an investment in infrastructure. We have many candidates in both parties who've talked about investment in infrastructure. The question for the American people, who's going to get that done? But we need an infrastructure investment that includes ensuring broadband access in our rural and high needs urban communities. We need infrastructure investment that helps us prepare for the consequences of climate change as well. This is a moment where, again, we need leadership that says it's not good enough to go back to where we were before COVID. We need something better.
Earlier this morning, I had the opportunity to speak with Congresswoman Shalala and Congresswoman McMorris Rodgers about this very issue. And an important point they continue to reemphasize is that addressing the digital divide is a bipartisan issue. People on both sides of the aisle in Congress really need to step up to find solutions to this very real problem. And I was very interested in what you would do or say if you were still Education Secretary in this moment to get Congress to be more aggressive and intentional in responding to this issue?
Yeah, I think we have to be clear about the stakes, the risk of a lost generation of students. We have the opportunity through the E-rate program or another mechanism to make a significant investment in K-12 internet access. We should do that urgently. We also need an urgent effort to make sure that we have internet access for our higher education students. We don't want to lose a generation of students there either. Congresswoman Eshoo and Senator Klobuchar have a bill that would focus dollars on higher ed internet access, particularly for our minority serving institutions and historically Black colleges and universities that historically have had fewer resources and are serving higher numbers of low-income students. We ought to take those steps so that students can complete their higher education so that they're better ready to compete in the 21st century economy and contribute to our long-term prosperity. And then the broader question is, what kind of society do we want to be? Do we want to be a society that is true to the principle of equality of opportunity for all? If we do, we have to make sure that every student has access to a high-quality education, and that today includes internet access and having a device where you can access your learning.
Well, Secretary King, we are so appreciative for you coming on to Post Live today to share your thoughts with us on this very relevant issue, and we look forward to talking to you more in the future.
Thanks for hosting a conversation about such an important and urgent topic.
Awesome. Take care. Well, that is all the time we have for right now, but it's not all the time that Post Live is going to devote today to these very important topics that so many voters and Americans and viewers are paying attention to most. At 2 p.m. today, Eastern Standard Time, my colleague, Matea Gold, is going to discuss election security, something that was very much a hot topic at last night's first presidential debate. Among her guests will be the Secretaries of State for Colorado and Washington. And tomorrow at 1 p.m., also Eastern Standard Time, Sally Quinn is going to have a discussion with best-selling author and former presidential candidate Marianne Williamson. So you can come back and engage in these conversations, or you can head to Washington Post Live and register for read more information about upcoming programs. And until then, I will look forward to seeing you back here.